All right, folks. So this has been a long-standing issue in Gaza, why Israel is so determined to keep the world's media out of Gaza. But in light of the blockade, more and more media sources have been asking this question, hey, why aren't we allowed in? So this is a piece in Haaretz dated May 21st. Of this year. Since Hamas's attack on October 7th and the start of the war, Israel has not permitted foreign journalists to enter Gaza, except through the one option available to Israeli journalists, spending a few hours in Gaza embedded with the Israeli army. Foreign journalists and bureaus have coped by working with local Palestinian journalists and stringers, freelance reporters, or those who were already in Gaza to gather information, footage, and stories, and through remote reporting. Even permission to enter with the IDF has been granted in limited, arbitrary, and non-transparent ways, say foreign correspondents in Israel. Being shut out is like having the carpet ripped out from under a story. It creates a serious obstacle to first-hand reporting and longer-term investigations, especially for smaller outlets or freelance journalists who don't have the resources to hire local staff in Gaza. A correspondent or bureau chief bears ultimate responsibility for their stories, but they can't go there as per CNN's tagline. That makes it hard to navigate competing claims and counterclaims in a war with an avalanche of both. So, again, just to call focus to this, permission to enter with the IDF has been granted in limited, arbitrary, and non-transparent ways. What they're talking about are guys like Douglas Murray, who brag about how they've been to Gaza. Yeah, right. You are escorted around by the IDF on a propaganda tour. They're actually not letting objective journalists from foreign countries in on their own. Now, again, this has been an existing dynamic since October 8th. I'm not sure why this is getting the kind of momentum that it's getting now. I think the blockade broke a lot of people. I think it woke a lot of people up to realities that they were blind to previously. Piers Morgan is certainly an example of that. So here is Piers Morgan asking Natasha Hausdorff, Israeli spokeswoman, about why journalists are not being allowed into Gaza. Now, she posts this as an example of him, I guess, revealing himself to be rude. This is Piers Morgan, like, at his best, making her look like an absolute lying fraud. So let's take a look at this.
Israel has decided no journalists from outside can go in.
For 3 reasons.
And make that assessment themselves.
Yes.
What right does Israel have to do that?
For 3 reasons. Will you allow me to finish?
Well, there are no reasons.
Well, you've
It's
just
none
asked
of your business whether the journalists view their safety as being at risk.
I'm sorry, you haven't heard the reasons yet. The first, of course, is the safety of the journalists, and I appreciate you don't accept that. The second...
I think it's a load of nonsense.
The second is the safety...
The idea you're doing is that some quaint concern for the safety of journalists is bullshit.
That was reason number one. Reason number two is the ability.
These better get better.
Is the ability of IDF soldiers to be able to conduct this war against Hamas without.
Without the journalists getting in the way.
No, without.
They've actually, by the way, they've killed more journalists in Palestinian journalists than in any war
Hamas
in
members
modern
wearing
history.
press vests are not journalists. And reason number three.
So none of them are journalists.
And reason number three.
So just to be clear, none of the Palestinian journalists who've been killed are actually journalists.
I said Hamas members.
Oh, they're all Hamas members.
Those that are. And
Piers is starting to catch on to what abject liars these people are. I bet he would redo a lot of the interviews that he did over the past year and a half now, knowing what he's learned about not only the experience of interviewing this woman, but the backlash, which we'll get into in the next segment.
Yeah, this is almost like he's having a Howard Beale kind of meltdown at this point in his career.
Right.
I just ran out of bullshit.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Every single dead Palestinian journalist is a member of Hamas. Is that your position?
No, listen, I appreciate Piers.
That is also bullshit.
But misrepresenting every
So that's 2 out of 2. What's the
right?
third reason?
Our mutual friend Douglas Murray was embedded with the IDF in Lebanon.
You said the words yourself. I love Douglas, but he was embedded with the IDF.
Right.
He's unbelievably pro-Israel.
Let me finish.
So of course he was going to write what he witnessed while embedded with the IDF.
No, let me finish what his experiences there were. The difference is that
you don't have to tell me.
There is something I think that you won't have heard. The IDF are able to allow journalists into Lebanon. He wasn't the only one. There were many other international journalists with him.
There have been a tiny... No.
Those other international journalists with him were very clear.
There have been a tiny handful of journalists led in by the IDF in tightly controlled environments to witness what the IDF were prepared to let them see.
And you know what those
And actually, what it needs,
said?
this war, to stop the bullshit, which is out of control, by the way, in this last 3 minutes, is to let international journalists go in and do their jobs. And they will worry with their networks or organizations about their safety, but they should be allowed to do their jobs. And there's only one reason why the Israeli government doesn't want international journalists crawling all over Gaza. It's because they do not want them reporting what they will find.
Reason number
which, by the
three.
way, will include the bodies of thousands of children who you, on the Israeli side, are not counting as you count the terrorists you kill, but who journalists would.
Reason number three is that those journalists that were in Lebanon said that they had to be very careful about what they reported because of what Hezbollah would do to their colleagues in Beirut. The fact that international journalists have sunk to this level, that they would allow their reportage to be controlled by terrorist organizations, Iranian proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah included, is despicable.
It's amazing you would say that, given the fact that the only way journalists can have access to Gaza is with an IDF escort, which means Israel is controlling what the journalists write. That is essentially what that means.
Yeah,
That is
I
the
mean,
real
yeah, their whole default is, this hyperventilating language of personal offense.
Right.
Despicable,
Exactly,
horrible, disgraceful.
Right.
That's all they have.
issue here that has driven
Actually,
the
it's not.
international
The real
community.
issue
Of course
is
it is.
it is,
This
well,
is terrorist organizations
the real-
propaganda.
actually,
that
it's
you
not.
have
Let me
eaten
bring
up.
David. Let me
and
bring
the fact
David.
that you will not allow me to answer a single question.
You know what?
here
You've made
will
all
be
your
perfectly
points, and they
evident to your
all, I'm
viewers.
afraid,
I
Natasha,
haven't. I certainly
turned out
haven't
to be
made all my
bullshit.
points.
So let me bring in David.
all turned out to be bullshit. Yeah, he was definitely patience wearing thin there. So obviously what he says there is true about Israel not wanting journalists going in there because they are afraid of what these journalists will find, not only the just abhorrent state of affairs there as it pertains to humanitarian conditions, not just in terms of violence and injuries and deaths and bodies, but in terms of famine and starvation and just the day-to-day horrors of life there will be covered in a way that Israel does not want covered. But I do have to say, I would quibble with the idea that Israel has no concern for the safety of the journalists. They don't have a quaint concern for the safety of the journalists. In other words, they're not concerned for the safety of the journalists because they care about the journalists. But I do think part of why they are not letting journalists in is because they know they are waging a campaign of indiscriminate mass murder. And it's one thing for them to kill 200 Palestinian journalists. Israel knows they cannot afford to have BBC reporters and CNN reporters and Washington Post reporters walking around Gaza being killed. Because if Israel were to kill white reporters, quite frankly, from Western outlets, that would create a massive problem for them.
World
and they don't
Central
trust themselves
Kitchen all over again.
Exactly, and they don't trust themselves not to do it. Why? Because they're bombing indiscriminately, and they know that if they let journalists in, they are going to inevitably kill a great number of them, and that's going to be very bad for them. So they do have a concern for their safety in that respect. It is because they are waging a genocidal campaign that they do not trust themselves not to kill journalists, quite frankly.
Right.
And that's a big reason why they won't let them in as well.
It's part of it. It is also what Piers pointed out. They do not. The last thing they want is for the world to see on CNN what they're doing there, because early on they did, and it didn't look good. We were very surprised that CNN was doing some of the reports they were doing from the West Bank and Gaza early in the war. They shut that down quick.
Yes, I believe CNN was nominated for an Emmy Award. It was the same woman who did the fake Syria prison story, oddly enough. But one of the stories that was not fake that she did was at that Gaza field hospital. And that got an Emmy nomination because it was an amazing report. Now, imagine doing that report now with conditions what they are now.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that was a few months in.
That was a few months in where you still had some semblance of an infrastructure. You still had passable roads. You still had power. In certain places. Now, forget about it. Now, the findings of those reports would be extraordinarily damning. And the work is so dangerous now. I'm telling you, Israel does not trust itself not to kill anybody because they're just dropping bombs left and right.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. And so that's why they want them out. And that's why you can come in with an IDF escort, because as long as you're close to the military, you're not going to get hit. Right. But
Well,
if you
because they're
go in there-
radioing in.
yeah, they're radioing in their location, their coordinates. They know they're not going to get struck. But if you're just walking around on your own as a freelancer, that's extremely dangerous. And that is a big part of why they're being kept out.
Please clap.